Snow fell on 22 January 1947 and did not stop for 2 months. Not 2 weeks, 2 months. By the time the thaw finally came in March, more than 4 million workers had been laid off, coal stocks had run to almost nothing, and the government had been forced to cut electricity to homes for hours each day. Britain had survived a world war, but the winter of 1947 came close to finishing what the Luftwaffe had started. This is File No. 14 of the Forgotten Britain Archive. What happened that winter has largely been absorbed into a general memory of post-war hardship, lumped in with rationing and bomb sites and making do. But the big freeze of 1947 was something specific, something distinct, and the families who lived through it developed strategies and habits that have since vanished entirely from British life. These are the methods, the rituals, and the quiet ingenuities that kept ordinary households alive when the temperature dropped to -16 in parts of Scotland and the snowdrifts buried farm animals whole. If you remember that winter, or if a parent or grandparent ever described what those weeks felt like, leave a note below. Every account is part of the archive. We begin not with the cold itself, but with what came the moment before it. The thing that made 1947 so devastating was not simply that it was cold, it was that nobody saw it coming in time. The winter of 1945 to 1946 had been mild, people had grown slightly easier in themselves. Rationing was still in force, tighter in some respects than it had been during the actual war, but there was a loosening of the collective breath. A Labour government had just won a landslide. The National Health Service was being planned. There was something in the air that felt, cautiously, like the future arriving. Then January 1947 came. The Met Office had issued no serious warning. On the morning of the 22nd, families in Yorkshire, the Midlands, and across South Wales woke to what seemed like a heavy frost. By afternoon, the snow was horizontal. By the following morning, roads in Lincolnshire and County Durham had already been lost under drifts that reached the tops of hedgerows, and unlike the cold snaps that British winters occasionally produce, this one did not break. It deepened. The first thing families did, within the first 72 hours, was consolidate their living space. This was not a decision made after careful thought. It was instinct, inherited from ration-era household management, and it was the single most important thing that kept people warm. A typical working-class terraced house in Sheffield or Coventry, or any of the mining towns of South Wales, had 4, sometimes 5 rooms. In normal winters, the family used all of them, more or less. In January 1947, within days of the freeze setting in, the back bedroom was abandoned. Then the parlour. Families pulled their lives into the kitchen, which was the only room with a range, and in many cases, the only room with any reliable source of heat at all. Children slept on chairs, pulled close to the range. Elderly relatives were brought down from upstairs. The dog, if there was one, was not put out at night. This compression of household life had a secondary effect that went beyond warmth. It forced a kind of intimacy that the architecture of the house had previously made optional. Grandparents who might have spent their evenings alone in a back room were suddenly part of every conversation. Children who would have gone to bed at 7 were awake until 10, listening to adults talk. Whole families relearned how to occupy the same small space, and in that occupation, passed down knowledge that would otherwise have waited years to be shared. But the consolidation of rooms only solved part of the problem. The other problem was the coal. Coal was still rationed in 1947. The standard household allocation was enough for ordinary winter use, not for a winter that would last until mid-March without a single significant thaw. By early February, coal merchants across the country had run dry. The government, under Emmanuel Shinwell, at the Ministry of Fuel and Power, was so badly prepared that it had not maintained strategic stockpiles at the pits. The coal was in the ground or already burned. There was almost nothing in reserve. Shinwell, to his enduring credit, said so publicly. He stood in the Commons and admitted that the situation was critical. It did not solve the crisis, but it meant that families at least understood what they were facing. What they did with that understanding was remarkable. The substitutes they found for coal tell you more about post-war resourcefulness than almost any other detail of that winter. In pit villages, families with any connection to the colliery sent their oldest children to sift through the slag heaps. Not for coal itself, but for small lumps of coke and compressed dust that had been discarded as waste during processing, mixed with damp newspaper rolled into tight balls and allowed to dry near the range. These slack bundles could extend a fire by several hours. The technique was not invented in 1947. It had been used during the war, but in 1947 it became necessary again for hundreds of thousands of households that had hoped, by then, to have moved beyond it. In rural areas, particularly in parts of Shropshire and the Welsh borders, where the snow made roads impassable for weeks at a stretch, families burned things they would never have considered fuel in any other winter. Old furniture that was broken beyond repair went first, then fence posts pulled from the edges of fields. Then, in cases where the situation became genuinely desperate, floorboards. There are accounts from farms near Ludlow of families pulling up the boards from an unused outbuilding and carrying them piece by piece to the kitchen range, rationing one board per evening to make the supply last. This is the point at which the memory of 1947 tends to diverge between those who experienced it in towns and those who experienced it in the countryside. Town families had neighbours close enough to share fuel. They had, in theory, access to emergency distribution points set up by local councils once the severity of the crisis became undeniable. Rural families had neither. What they had was land, and the knowledge of what that land contained, and the willingness to use both without sentiment. The farmers of the East Riding of Yorkshire faced a specific and terrible problem. The snow drifts in some parts of that county reached over 15 feet by the second week of February. Livestock were buried alive in fields. The task of finding them, digging down through the packed snow with long rods to locate where an animal was still breathing, and then excavating fast enough to pull it out before exhaustion or cold killed it, became a daily occupation. Farm hands and family members worked in rotating shifts through the night. Some animals were saved after being buried for 4 or 5 days. The technique of probing with rods, which the older farmhands had learned from their own fathers in the hard winters of the 1890s, was passed directly to young men who had spent the previous 6 years in North Africa and Italy, and who had never expected to need it. The livestock that could not be saved, or that were slaughtered because there was no fodder left to keep them through to spring, were butchered on site. In normal circumstances, regulations required animals to be killed at licensed abattoirs. In February 1947, with roads buried and no prospect of transport, those regulations were quietly suspended at the local level. Farmers butchered their own animals in barns and outhouses, and the meat was distributed to neighbouring households before it could spoil. Neighbourhoods that had barely spoken in the normal run of things found themselves sharing cuts of pork and mutton, simply because the alternative was waste. The food problem was not limited to rural areas. In towns and cities, the combination of frozen roads, burst pipes in warehouses, and a transport network that had ground almost entirely to a stop meant that supply chains collapsed with a speed that shocked even those who had managed wartime shortages. Bread was rationed for the first time ever in Britain on a formal basis, in the summer of that same year, partly as a consequence of the harvest losses that followed the freeze. But during the winter itself, the immediate problem was getting what food did exist, from where it was stored to where it was needed. Women in working-class communities organized this distribution in ways that have received almost no historical attention. In streets across the industrial Midlands and the North, women who had run street-level food-sharing networks during the Blitz revived those networks without being asked. An older woman in a terrace in Nottingham, or Burnley, or Stoke would know which households had no man present, which had infants, which had elderly residents who could not go out. She would know where the nearest shop was and when its last delivery had come. These women walked through snow to collect what was available, divided it according to need, and distributed it with a precision that owed nothing to official instruction and everything to a community architecture that had been built over decades. The children of those streets remember it differently from their parents. For children, particularly those between 7 and 14, the Big Freeze of 1947 had a quality that adult memory has never quite captured accurately, which is that it was, in certain specific and bounded ways, extraordinary rather than terrible. School closures began within the first 2 weeks. Many schools in rural areas did not reopen until the first week of March. For children in those schools, the freeze meant 6 weeks away from classrooms, and 6 weeks, as any child knows, is very nearly forever. What they did with those weeks varied enormously by location and circumstance. In the mining towns, boys were put to work almost immediately, helping to carry coal, clear paths, run messages between households. In the more prosperous streets of market towns in Oxfordshire and Wiltshire, children built structures in the snow of a scale and ambition that peacetime winters simply did not allow. Tunnels were dug through the drifts that accumulated along garden walls. Some of these tunnels were long enough to crawl through for several feet, reinforced with pieces of wood from sheds, lit at intervals with candles. Children who built these structures did so with no instruction and no supervision, and the structures, in some cases, lasted for weeks before the thaw took them. But the cold came inside too, and this was where the domestic ingenuity of the period was sharpest. Draft-proofing, in a 1947 working-class house, was not a product you bought. It was something you made, from what you had: old stockings stuffed with newspapers and laid along the bottom of doors, curtains taken down from upstairs rooms that were no longer in use, hung instead over the inside of downstairs doors to act as additional insulation. Rugs that in ordinary life lived on bedroom floors were moved to drape over the insides of windows overnight, not to block light, which there was precious little of in any case, but to create an additional barrier against the cold that came through the single-pane glass. The bed itself became an engineering project. A family that had been given a standard pre-war ration of blankets might have 2 or 3 per bed. In 1947, coats went on top of blankets, curtains went on top of coats, towels, tablecloths, anything with any weight or density at all was pressed into service. The aim was not comfort. The aim was to trap enough warmth from the body that sleep became possible. In households where the range had gone cold by midnight and would not be relit until morning, the bed was the only warm place in the building. Mothers with young children developed a specific practice that several accounts from that winter describe in almost identical terms, in letters and diaries from households as far apart as Aberdeen and Swansea. The child was dressed for bed in every layer of clothing that still fitted, then placed in the middle of the bed, with the mother sleeping on one side and another adult or older sibling on the other. The child became, in effect, the warm core of a human sandwich. It was not called anything. It was just what you did. Hot water bottles were in use, but the supply of rubber was still constrained by post-war shortages, and many families did not have them, or had cracked ones that leaked. The substitute was a brick. A house brick, placed in the range or beside it for several hours, would hold heat for long enough to warm the foot of a bed, wrapped in an old jumper or a piece of sacking to avoid burns. This practice was older than the 20th century, but a generation that might have assumed it had been superseded found it essential again. The thaw, when it finally came in the second week of March, brought its own crisis. Frozen pipes burst as they warmed, flooding rooms that had survived the freeze intact. Roads that had been solid under ice became rivers of meltwater overnight. The moorland above Sheffield and across the Pennines shed its snow in a matter of days, and the rivers below ran higher than they had in living memory. The flooding that followed the 1947 Big Freeze was, in many affected areas, as damaging as the freeze itself had been. And then, quietly, Britain went back to normal. The electricity came back on full hours, coal distribution resumed, schools reopened. The food that the freeze had disrupted began to move again through the supply chain, but something had happened in those 2 months that did not go back to normal, or at least not entirely. The skills that had been used, the improvised fuel, the consolidated rooms, the street-level food networks, the draft-proofing from curtains and coats, the brick in the bed, had all been used by people who already possessed them, not taught, not looked up, not worked out from first principles, but reached for from memory, from the memory of previous hard winters and war years and the generation before that. The people who pulled up floorboards in Shropshire and probed snowdrifts in Yorkshire with long rods had learned those things. They had been given them by parents who had in turn been given them. And the winter of 1947 was perhaps the last occasion in British history when that chain of practical knowledge was tested at national scale and held. Within a decade, central heating would begin to appear in new builds. Within 2 decades, it would reach the majority of British homes. The draft-proofing rituals, the consolidated rooms, the brick in the bed, the skill of reading a coal fire to make it last the night. These things began their long fade from practice and then from memory. The children who built tunnels through the drifts in February 1947 are in their 80s now. Most of them are still here. If any of them are watching, or if you are the child or grandchild of someone who remembers that winter, leave an account below. The specific details, the brick in a certain road in Coventry, the dog that slept by the range in Pontypridd, the curtain over the back door in Aberdeen, those details are what this archive is for. This was file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. There are 99 more in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.